You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with my husband, Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Here is episode 157. Does toxic mold grow on dirt? Before we get started on this episode, a short or not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed herein. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 20 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all solo podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon about mold and dealing with mold in your home at amazon.com/author/Steve Worsley. And if you're interested in scheduling a mold consultation, over the phone consultation with Steve, you can be sure to find out more about those and his availability at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a brand new episode of the Toxic Mold Podcast. Steve, it is May.
Yep, May 9th.
Yeah, and Mother's Day is done and over with.
Yep, so happy Mother's Day to all the mothers listening, or happy Mother's Day a day late.
Exactly.
Since we don't record on Sundays. But.
Well, and I remember being a kid, and one thing my mother always encouraged us to do was to play in the dirt. So this is a good episode because you're going to answer the question, can mold grow on dirt? Where did this topic come from?
It's quite often, actually, that I get asked by clients, especially those with crawl spaces, can mold grow on dirt? And I look at them kind of weird, like, well, it shouldn't. And normally the reason they think that that it's mold is there can be some discoloration, white fuzzy stuff that they think is mold. And so, something that we just want to talk about. And since it is spring, everything's, well, it should be wet, but here we're getting snow still. So
exactly. It's still the tundra over here in Wyoming. But where does it come from that people asking because they want to know, are they getting mold in their flower beds outside, or is it more like their crawl spaces?
Okay. Typically.
Okay.
Like outside, I have had clients that have concerns outside, but for the most part, if you have mold growing or you think it's mold outside, that's not a problem for the most part because it's outside. So it's not in a contained environment, so it shouldn't cause the issues you would think it would. But yeah, typically, they're asking because of the crawl space. There's homes that are over a crawl space. Some of our listeners have homes that are, split levels where there's only a small crawl space, maybe underneath the kitchen or living room area, things like that. So, like I said, I see, a lot of times we'll see mushrooms growing, and then usually, like I said, kind of a white fuzzy substance, which I have done tape lifts or swabs, and it is mold, but it's not really sustainable to grow in dirt.
And when you say, not sustainable, you mean it could just expand and grow?
Yeah, when I say sustainable, it means a mold infestation is not growing.
Okay.
It's not getting larger. So, I've seen it where it's in lots of different areas in a crawl space, but, the reason that it has that is because of elevated humidity levels.
Okay.
So, our listeners should know that if you have a mold concern or there's mold growing, it has to have humidity over 60%.
Okay. And so then, so you were just talking about elevated humidity. Under what other conditions could mold grow on dirt, per se?
Well, it'd have to have organic materials, or cellulose materials, stuff like, of course, in crawl spaces, we see a lot of storage or people storing things. So cardboard boxes, I don't know if you've seen it when we go do some bids, but a lot of times we see Christmas ornaments and Christmas stuff that's stored down there. And, I've seen where people just open the crawl space or, the access that's typically if it's inside of a home. We've seen where they literally just throw trash down there. And so it would have to have something, a cellulose material for its food to grow. There's not enough, materials in the soils themselves for the mold to be sustainable. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. Okay. And what about, I'm thinking mold in plant pots. So you said outdoors is not such a big issue with mold and dirt, but if you have plants and pots inside the house, is that a concern?
Yeah. So, we've talked about plants inside homes and house plants, and, I probably ruffled feathers for our listeners that love their plants, but, those, we've talked about it, when the leaves decay, that introduces mold spores into the air, and obviously right there at the soils, it can cause problems, but it doesn't, for the most part, unless you're overwatering it shouldn't be an issue. And if you're cleaning up the dead leaves, that shouldn't be a concern either. So at the end of the day, it's prevention, maintenance, things like that would prevent it.
Okay, so then if somebody's listening and they are concerned about moist soils, let's say in their crawl space, what should they be doing? How do they address it?
Well, you'd have to figure out what's causing it. Root cause analysis would be the first step. And for our listeners, of course, I always recommend a professional, but you don't really have to have a professional come decide or determine, hey, the grading and drainage isn't proper on the outside. It could be, especially this time of year, so we see it, quite often in the spring, a lot of times in the summers, or especially around here, when all the ranchers are irrigating, the crawl spaces get wet. So I guess my point is with that, sometimes it's only a problem for a couple months out of the year. It could be a problem throughout the entire year if you have groundwater issues. So it could be a grading issue if it's a groundwater issue. Grading's easy to fix. Groundwater issues, you'd have to put sump pumps in your crawl space in those soils, or do a drain tile system or French drain, all sorts of stuff. But to answer your question, they would have to figure out what's elevating those humidity levels in the crawl space to begin with. Like, why are those soils moist?
And so now, if they wanted to have a professional come and address that, who do they hire to do that sort of thing?
I can only speak for my expertise, but they could hire a mold inspector or a home inspector, a grading contractor. But, at the end of the day, is that necessary? I don't know. If it's something, to figure it out, I would hope, that our listeners know enough about what we've told them in podcasts to say, hey, this is a grading and drainage issue, so we're going to go, get some dirt or hire a grading contractor to come in and fix that. So to answer your question, they can, I don't know what every other inspector contractor's expertise is, but just a general home inspector should be able to figure that out. Should is the key word.
And so I guess my other thing is, if somebody's listening to this and they're thinking about buying a house, or they're in the process of building a house, most people assume that, well, if I'm buying the house, I'm going to get a home inspection. And if there were some moisture issues in the crawl space, that home inspection would pick that up. Or if it's a brand new house, they would say, well, should, exactly. If it's a brand new house, I'm assuming the general contractor knows what he or she is doing, and there's going to be no problems in the crawl space. Is there anything that home buyers, whether they're building a home or buying an existing home, what should they be on the lookout for to just verify before they purchase a home that there's no issues with that crawl space?
Well, depending on where they live. So, where we live, we don't see a whole lot of sump pumps in a crawl space, because it's, obviously the way it freezes here, plus our soils aren't conducive for elevated humidity. So we don't have really wet clays. We have a lot more sand here. and it's fairly dry, depending on where you're at.
And so you're talking about the type of soil, because lots of people don't understand. Like, I didn't understand, honestly, that there were different types of soils until you start talking about it and saying things like clay. So let's just explain that for all of us lay people who don't get that not all soil is created equal. Right.
So you could have, and obviously I'm not a specialist in this, but, you do. So when you're a developer, and we're going to go way back to the beginning of a subdivision, when they develop a subdivision, depending on where it's at, but for the most part, not here. So for our listeners, they know that Wyoming's a little laid back when it comes to this stuff, but typically a developer, when they're developing that subdivision, they have to do testing, soils tests. And the purpose of that is to see, how much moisture's in the soil, how expansive the soils are, to know what they have to do to prevent structural issues.
Okay.
So, to do that soils test, they drill a hole, they do all sorts of stuff that's well beyond me, but that's how they determine what type of foundations, what type of footings they do, if that makes sense. So you have places like that are on the coast, in Hawaii, the Keys, South Carolina, that if they're right on the coast, you see that they're built on piers. Mm-hmm. Just like high-rise buildings, they drill down deep with piers. And it's so that they have something very stable. Whereas if you were to just build a home, let's say, like around here, you could go with a typical footings and foundation, just a poured concrete. You wouldn't have to do anything extensive per se, if that makes sense, to prevent structural issues. So, you could be in a place where there's lots of sands. You could be in a place where it's a lot more rock. And so, if there's a lot more rock, the moisture is not going to be as high in the soils. If you're in a lot of clays, obviously you're going to have higher moisture concerns.
Okay.
And so in those clays, and it's always wet because of the moisture content of that clay, the dirt, you would have to do something like sump pumps.
Gotcha. Okay.
Now, when you have something where, like I was talking earlier, where you have a crawl space, and we see it quite often around here, because, these ranchers, they literally flood irrigate. It's not sprinklers they just turn on, they literally flood their pastures. Well, for the homes, that water comes into those crawl spaces and it gets wet for a couple months out of the year and then it goes away. Things like that, you'd have to take in all those factors to determine how you're going to fix a water or moisture concern in a crawl space.
Okay.
It's not just as simple as, we have a humidity gauge in our crawl space and it stays consistently high. Let's just, fix the grading on the outside. It could be something in the soils, which would require a lot more work, like a drain tile system. And I probably got way too deep in the weeds for
I think that helps
our listeners.
I think it helps people to understand is that whether you're building a house or you're buying a house, you want to understand for this geographic location, what are the soils like? Was the crawl space inspected? Do all the soils look normal on the inspection given where the area is?
Right.
And is the foundation and or the crawl space structured properly along with draining and gradage so it reduces the likelihood of issues in that crawl space?
Yes. Yeah, that's, something I didn't even talk about was in a crawl space, one of the most important things to keep the humidity down is a vapor barrier. So plastic on the floor and the walls. And that's, as that's something pretty common that we do. For the most part, we won't even do a mold mitigation job in a crawl space unless they're going to, number one, fix the reason why there's moist soils. And second of all, it has to, whether we do it, which typically that's how it goes. I'm not going to get into our mitigation processes, but, they have to address why the soils are moist, and they needed to have preventative measures like ventilation and a vapor barrier.
So if someone is buying a house and they know that house is a crawl space, they should see if there's a vapor barrier.
Yeah, they don't even have to crawl down in there.
Okay.
And for our listeners, if they're building or buying a home, they can ask, whether it's the contractor or if they hire a home inspector, hey, what were the soils like in the crawl space? Is there a vapor barrier? What type of ventilation's down there? What's the moisture in the soils like? And if the inspector or the contractor can't answer those questions, you probably should hire somebody else. And that's why it's hard for me to say, well, they should just know. Because that's what I assume.
Mm-hmm.
Like a home inspector should know.
Yeah.
A contractor should know. Well, it all depends on the expertise and what type of contractor or inspector you get.
Well, and I think what helps about an episode like this is now the consumer knows what they should be asking.
Exactly.
But if I don't know what to ask, if I don't know to ask about a vapor barrier, then I never do.
Exactly. And it's something like a vapor barrier, for us to do, let's just say it's a 2,000 square foot home. To install a vapor barrier down in the crawl space after we've done mold mitigation, or just to install one, you're only talking, and for our listeners that are somewhat handy or, it doesn't bother them to put a vapor barrier down there, you're literally talking about a few $100s in I call it visqueen, but it's plastic sheeting. I don't know where. When I started working for my uncle, that's what we called it, was visqueen. I don't know where the term came from, honestly.
Yeah.
I say it to a lot of people and they look at me like I'm weird, but the plastic sheeting's not hard. And when we do a vapor barrier, we've talked about it. Ours is, it's water. It's not a waterproofer. It's just to keep the humidity levels down.
Exactly.
Meaning you could put a vapor barrier down, but if you have a lot of moisture in the soils, you're still going to have issues.
Exactly.
But I guess what I was saying is it's so easy to do it, and even if you do like we do, we use staples and we tape all the seams and everything. For a couple guys, it only takes, 10 hours max. So it's just something that's worth having down in your crawl space. That vapor barrier is important.
An ounce of prevention equals a pound of cure.
Exactly.
So what's your call to action for people?
So like we were just talking about, you mentioned houseplants. Just check the houseplants. We already did an episode about plants and homes. But just make sure that you don't have fuzzy, weird looking stuff growing in those soils. In a crawl space, same thing. If you have mushrooms or anything like that growing, that tells you the humidity is very high, or the moisture content is very high, which high moisture content in the soils, no vapor barrier, elevates the humidity in the crawl space, which could lead to mold concerns.
And can you put a humidity gauge in a crawl space?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
We talk about it all the time. We're going to do an episode here in a few weeks with mold prevention tools. How often do we talk about a humidity gauge?
All the time.
Yeah. It is one of the, in my opinion, leading causes to mold issues that is just overlooked because people don't have the proper equipment to monitor it. And it's simple.
Absolutely.
You have a thermometer right here, and we have them throughout the house it's a thermometer and a humidity gauge. And we pay attention, or I do. I know you do in the bathroom. You pay attention to what it's doing.
Absolutely.
So if something's out of the norm, you got to come find me and say, hey, there's
something wrong.
The humidity's always high in this bathroom. What's going on?
Yeah. All right. Humidity gauge. Do a quick inspection.
Yep.
And vapor barriers are
exactly.
great thing.
Yep. And it's, we have an email list. You probably can explain it way better than I can. All I know is you go sign up on the website.
Yes, you can sign up for the mold investigation checklist at cnccontractorservices.com. All right. We'll catch you in the next episode. Prevent toxic mold exposure before it gets in your home. Download Steve's free mold investigation checklist at tinyurl.com/CNC mold checklist. Again, download Steve's free mold investigation checklist at tinyurl.com/CNC mold checklist.